Unrest continues to grow in Nicaragua as President Daniel Ortega insists pro-democracy protesters are to blame for increased violence throughout the country. Demonstrators want Ortega to resign, but he has refused, despite calls from the international community. Manuel Bojorquez is in the capital city of Managua.
For Ortega's critics, this was not just another protest. It was another day in the fight against a regime they call oppressive.
This started in many ways as a student movement. If you look around here, you can see it still resembles very much that. A lot of the people here are young, and they say this is about their future.
Protesters like this young man hide behind masks.
Protection from what? Because you've been threatened.
Ortega has governed Nicaragua for 22 of the last 39 years, increasingly amassing more wealth and power, critics say. In an interview Monday, Ortega explained why he and his wife, the vice president, won't step down. He says, we were elected by the voters. Elections begin in 2021, and then we'll have to see who will be voted in. His supporters say he's earned their vote and denounced the protesters as violent. They are harming an entire community. They've destroyed a city. They've destroyed a country, this woman says. But while not a civil war, this woman says there are already political prisoners. She claims her husband, a former military officer, has been jailed for almost a month after refusing to join a paramilitary group fighting the demonstrators. I can't rest because I know the regime is capable of whatever in order to convict an innocent man, she said. So I'm fearful, I'm scared. But she also later added, Nicaragua has decided to defend itself.
That may make this conflict prolonged.
Yes.
And joining us now is the executive director of the Nicaraguan Foundation for Economic and Social Development, Juan Sebastian Chamorro. Juan, thank you so much for joining us. Yesterday, President Daniel Ortega said once again that he would not be stepping down as president. Does that change anything for the protesters who want him removed from office?
Well, first of all, thanks, Tanya, for having me in the program. It doesn't change anything. We were suspecting that at one point he will publicly would say so. Last June 7th, he met the bishops, and the bishops asked him in a letter to consider early elections in 2019, and he never answered the letter. So. Now he is answering through this extremely rare interview. We have to remember that this is the first interview that Ortega gives in 10 years. So its intention was clearly to send this particular message. He says that to anticipate the elections will bring instability. We think the contrary. To maintain Ortega, to stay in power until 2021 will bring more misery, will bring more economic unrest, and will bring more protest to the Nicaraguan people. What the Nicaraguan people are trying to do is precisely to call for an early election and try to see this as a solution to the humanitarian crisis that we are suffering. Again, 300 people already dead and more than 2,000 people wounded. In addition to that, several people have been in prison without due process, like my colleague at the Civil Alliance for Justice and Democracy, Medardo Mairena, who was seated at the table, at the negotiation table in the National Dialogue. He is in prison he has been in prison for the last 2 weeks, and we haven't heard anything from him.
Which is awful. Explain a little bit, if you would, the Nicaraguan Constitution to us, because the protesters are calling for early elections, but Ortega has been in office for decades. So how early are these elections?
Well, the constitutional terms ends in 2021, but the Constitution, as any constitution in the world, has its capability of being reformed. So you need a temporary reform to shorten the period of the president to, say, 2019 and call for an early elections. This is a constitution that unfortunately was changed by President Ortega in the last 3 years. In 2016, he reformed the Constitution, which before did not allow for re-election. So he ran for office without this, without changing the Constitution. Actually, he got a rule from the Supreme Court saying that not to run for president will hurt his human rights, so he ran for office even when the Constitution rejected or prohibited re-election. So, and then he reformed the Constitution. So now at this moment, he's saying that the Constitution cannot be reformed. It's a completely nonsense. You know, this interview the intention was to show a completely different reality of what is happening in Nicaragua. In addition to that, we have to mention that several organizations, international organizations, have stated repeatedly in the last 11 years that the electoral system is fraudulent. So the last elections where Ortega was elected was the result of an electoral fraud. This has been documented by many organizations, including the Organization of American States, the European Union, who had stated irregularities in the election process, not only in the presidential election, the last one in 2016, but also in the municipal elections throughout this that last decade. So legitimacy is certainly not an issue here, because we're talking about a government that was elected through an electoral fraud.
Now, isn't that an issue then, even if these early elections take place? Aren't protesters worried that they simply won't be fair?
Well, that's the reason why we cannot have early elections this year, because if we call for elections in 2018, Ortega will win by 100% of the votes. What we need to do first is to reform the Electoral Council, get rid of all the magistrates of the Electoral Council, get rid of the system, which is, as I say, corrupt, and try to reform the system. And according to the experts, this process will take until, say, February 2019, and that's the reason why we're calling early election until early next year, because we need to work on building a new democratic and honest system that will respect the will of the people, that will count the votes in an honest manner. That's the objective that we are presenting at the Civil Alliance for Justice and Democracy, the National Dialogue. So there's work to be done before getting a fair and true election. Also, the international community have to come with us and help us with the observation of this process as it happened in 1990, where Ortega was lost the elections that year.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask you, as you mentioned earlier, this was the first time that we heard from Daniel Ortega in quite a while in this interview. How have protesters there in Nicaragua responded to his words? Has this in any way calmed things down, or are protesters even more energized?
He wanted to present that we are living in a kind of a normal situation now, which is completely not true. This morning, 6 people died, 5 in the northern town of Jinotega, attacked by the military, or the paramilitary people, personnel that he said yesterday that he had no information about it. So that was the first thing that we want to refute. And another person was assassinated early this morning. She was a medical doctor from Brazil, was killed in the city of Managua. So first, to state that state of normal situation in Nicaragua is false. Then he also mentioned that the protests had not been attacked, and more than 9 people have been attacked during the protest, peaceful protest in Managua. So I think the interview, which by the way was more the objective was more for the American people. In Nicaragua, what the reaction is completely people. We just don't believe this situation, this interpretation of reality. We see the president talking about a completely different country with a completely different narrative, blaming the protesters of being responsible for the killings, when we know, as a matter of fact, documented by international organizations, that are the paramilitaries under his control, the ones doing the repression, the ones firing live ammunition like AK-47 and live ammunition to the protesters. The protests are still going on. There was a big march yesterday, and I think it will continue, as well as the international pressure will continue. Also, we have the Organization of American States who issued a very strong resolution last week, 21 countries against only 3, accusing the government of Nicaragua as being responsible for the violations of human rights, including the right for life, expression and mobilization. So this is a clear message of the international community that this narrative that President Ortega wants to present, that wanted to present yesterday to the American people, is completely false. When you have an entire inter-American system accusing the government of Nicaragua, of blaming the government of Nicaragua, is that this narrative that he's trying to present is certainly unbelievable for most of the entire world.
Juan Sebastian Chamorro, thank you so much for joining us today.